Yeah, thanks everybody. And yeah, thanks for having me. And good afternoon. Like I said, or Susan mentioned, this is actually study the PIs are Dan Iserman and Dan Demkowski with the Wisconsin Cooperative Fisheries Research Unit, but we do collaborate on this project. So I'm really excited to be the one to share the information with you all today. So I'll be covering sort of a broad scope of work, what's known as the Lake Whitefish Strategic Plan, and it currently encompasses 6 phases. So this work kicked off back in 2017, looking to get a better understanding of the primary lake whitefish stocks that are contributing to fisheries in and around Green Bay. So phases 1 and 2 have largely been completed, so I'll go over sort of a summary of results there and some applications to management. I'll talk about phases 3 and 4, which are currently ongoing as well. And then I'll touch on, or just wanted to mention that phases 5 and 6 are still planned, although we will likely wait to pursue funding for those phases until the next funding cycle, until we sort of, as Tom mentioned, some of that will be dictated by moving receivers around to establish a lake-wide Lake Michigan grid. So to kind of distill all of those phases into objectives, what we're really looking to do is identify stock-specific movements, various spatial distributions, fishery contributions, and identify sources of recruitment for fisheries in various management units in and around Green Bay. And to answer all these questions, we are utilizing acoustic telemetry. So since 2017, we have tagged 1,100 fish. And taking a little bit closer look at the infrastructure that supports this work, there are 255 acoustic receivers, and that accounts for receivers in Green Bay proper, as well as some of the primary tributaries to Green Bay, like the Fox, Oconto, Peshtigo, and Menominee rivers. And sort of a big addition is the receivers that you see over kind of in the open waters of Lake Michigan. Relatively new addition. I think they were put in place in 2024. They kind of run from on the Door Peninsula of Wisconsin up into the UP of Michigan. And it will be referencing sort of a couple different spatial areas around Green Bay. So for folks that aren't familiar, I'll be mentioning Bay de Noc in northern Green Bay, and that's really just the area sort of north and above the red dash line. I'll also be mentioning southern Green Bay, and what we mean by that is just simply the area below or south of the red dash line. And this is actually the first of several opportunities that I'm going to take to recognize all of our partners and collaborators. This is a multi-year, very large spatial scale effort, and we could not accomplish what we have done to date without those partners. So specifically with sampling and receiver maintenance, we get a lot of assistance with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Green Bay. That's my home office, as well as folks with the Hammond Bay Biological Station and GLaDOS, and folks with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So just to cover kind of some of the outcomes and management applications, again, this is sort of summarizing what we've learned from phases 1 and 2. First, some of our movement information has led to an update in the catch and age modeling process for Wisconsin waters. Just for context, historically, there used to be just a single stock assessment model, but that has now been split into 2, and this is just sort of derived from some of the movement information we gleaned from our telemetry results, suggesting that whitefish that spawn in Green Bay tend to stay in Green Bay, and whitefish that are spawning in the open waters of Lake Michigan tend to stay out in the open waters of Lake Michigan. We've also learned more about sort of various tagging techniques by comparing inferences on movement gleaned from comparing acoustic telemetry to conventional tagging techniques like Floyd tags. We've also learned a bit more about sort of telemetry best practices with respect to lake whitefish. So we have tried a couple different immobilization techniques, one being sort of traditional anesthetic like acquiesce, as well as electro-immobilization techniques, things like a TENS unit. We found that both are effective, although sort of the electro-immobilization techniques tend to have a shorter induction and recovery time, which can be beneficial for field-based tagging operations and limiting handling time. We've also learned a bit more about the thermal ecology of whitefish in Green Bay. So in 2017, 400 of the fish that got acoustic transmitters also got temperature loggers, which is what you're seeing down here. And at that time, I believe this was before the temperature loggers were actually integrated into the acoustic tag. So the big caveat there being is that we actually had to recover those temperature sensors in order to get the data returned to us. We were able to recover 13 of those sensors with usable data, and sort of in the bottom right here, you'll see sort of an example of a thermal profile for a fish over the course of just about a year. And what was interesting is what we found for whitefish in southern Green Bay. They were actually inhabiting water temperatures that were both below and above at various different times of the year, temperatures that were previously reported in the literature as their thermal optimal or within their broad thermal niche. So this is kind of better helping define what we understand as suitable habitat for lake whitefish and potentially help us better quantify total habitat availability. And then sort of finally, we are learning more about how these fish are using tributaries. So things like entry and exit dates, which will tell us a little bit about sort of the cues that they're using in terms of run timing. And this is also informing management by potentially informing times of the year where we'd be, it may be advantageous to close recreational fishing because these fish start to aggregate below barriers to some of our primary tributaries in Green Bay. And everything I just covered has largely been published on, so if folks want additional information, I encourage folks to check out all those publications listed there. And now I'm sort of transitioning to present day, so to reorient folks, again, this is phase 3 of the project, where we're really looking to understand the contributions of different spawning strategies and locations to whitefish fisheries in southern Green Bay. This work is funded through the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act with some key partners, including Wisconsin DNR, Michigan DNR, folks at Fish and Wildlife Service, GLADOS, and Michigan State University. And really what I mean here by spawning strategies, we're sort of trying to refine, are they primarily tributary spawners or primarily open lake spawners? And we're specifically interested in southern Green Bay because it's sort of been a bright spot in terms of lake whitefish adult population sizes and sustained recruitment, although there is still signs in southern Green Bay that recruitment may be becoming less consistent in recent years. So to get at these answers, we are targeted to tag 300 whitefish in southern Green Bay, with half of those coming from the commercial fishery and half coming from the recreational fishery. I will say it was relatively easier to get our hands on commercially attained fish. It's, those guys are in the business of getting their hands on fish. So all of that tagging wrapped up in 2023. It was relatively more challenging, actually, to get our hands on fish from the recreational fishery. The whitefish fishery in Green Bay on the recreational side is highly dependent on ice conditions annually. So for the previous few winters, we've had pretty poor ice conditions in Green Bay. But this most recent winter of sort of 25 and 26, we've had a pretty outstanding ice season in terms of ice quality and duration. So we were actually able to get the remainder of those tags out in the rec fishery as of earlier this month. And taking just sort of a very early first cut look at the results from this work. So we're only looking at a few fish here that were sort of the initial cohort of fish tagged in 2022 in the commercial fishery. And what we're seeing on the right here is sort of a density plot of unique detections. And this is for the week of November 12th, which is what we're interpreting as really sort of the peak of the spawning window for lake whitefish in southern Green Bay. And a couple key takeaways here. It's interesting that very few fish actually made movements that suggest that they were spawning in tributaries. And secondly, we are actually seeing sort of an aggregation of fish in the open waters of Green Bay, kind of on the west shore of Green Bay. So probably from an area outside the mouth of the O'Connell River, maybe as far north as outside the Menominee River, with this one hotspot on a bathymetric feature known as Young's Reef. So there could be fish aggregating sort of on that shoal habitat. So we're really interested in sort of watching these trends and see what new patterns might emerge as we continue to get more data back from additional cohorts of tagged fish. And just to reorient folks, so now I'm moving into phase 4 of the project. And with this phase, we're moving out of southern Green Bay and up into northern Green Bay, into Big Bay to Knock, which is circled in the red here. And that is in Whitefish Management Unit WFM 01. And we're interested in this area to better define the movements and spatial distribution of these fish in northern Green Bay. Again, this work is funded by the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act, with some additional key partners, including the Little Traverse Bay Bands, Sault Ste. Marie Tribe, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Michigan State University, and Wisconsin Sea Grant. And we had some kind of questions remaining from some initial tagging data where we saw that whitefish spawning in Big Bay to Knock are leaving shortly thereafter. And we didn't really know where those fish were ending up. And secondly, there's only few fish from other spawning groups are actually going to Big Beta Knock during the non-spawning period. And that's sort of suggesting that recruitment in Big Beta Knock may be being outsourced to adjacent management units. So to get at sort of answers to these questions that we have remaining, namely we're trying to understand where do fish spawning in Big Beta Knock go after they spawn, and where do fish tagged in Big Beta Knock during the non-spawning period go to spawn. So to answer these questions, we're going to put out 200 additional tags. Roughly half of those tags are already out, with the remaining half going out in the spring of 2026 in sort of those non-spawning aggregations, as well as in fall of 2026 in those spawning aggregations. And again, just a very early cut of the data that we have back. Preliminary data suggests that over 75% of the fish that spawned in Big Beta Knock actually for fall of 2024 left and spent time south of Chambers Island in southern Green Bay. And sort of just to wrap things up, this is not in sort of that strategic plan, but it's an additional whitefish project that's in Green Bay and telemetry focused. We are interested in understanding more about the latent mortality of lake whitefish and walleye discarded from commercial and recreational fisheries in Green Bay. Again, this project is funded with the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act in partnership with the Wisconsin DNR, as well as some of our key commercial fishermen partners in Green Bay. And we're really trying to understand what is the fate of fish after catch and release in both the commercial and recreational fishery. For context here, the commercial fishery in Wisconsin is managed with a quota system, but also a 17-inch minimum length limit, whereas the recreational fishery is simply managed with a 10-fish daily bag limit and no size limit. So there's expectations that there's sort of some catch and release in both of those fisheries. And our goal here is to provide information to the Wisconsin DNR to help inform management decisions, give them better information on sources of mortality that both of these fisheries are experiencing, and this may help inform potential regulation changes and mitigate conflict between the various user groups of this fishery in Green Bay, which with more information. So again, this is going to be a telemetry approach. We're aiming to tag 240 fish. Again, this work has just started, so no results yet, but I encourage folks to stay tuned for results soon. And I'll just end by acknowledging all the myriad of partners that have been involved with this work. Again, it's a long-standing effort covering a wide spatial area, so almost too many folks to name, but wanted to thank everybody for their assistance with this work. And then I left the contact information for both Dan Demkowski and Dan Iserman at the bottom there for folks to follow up with sort of in-depth questions, but I'm also happy to take any clarifying questions that we have today. So thank you, everybody.